The sun had barely crept above the horizon on that late summer morning in 1944, casting long shadows across the French coastline at Pas-de-Calais. Inside Observation Post 4, a cluster of German technical officers huddled around a wooden desk, their faces illuminated by the pale light filtering through the bunker's narrow windows. It was 6:15 in the morning, and the morning report they were examining made absolutely no sense. The numbers scrawled across the crumpled paper defied every principle of ballistic mathematics they'd been taught during their training at the Luftwaffe's technical academies scattered throughout the Reich. 82% destroyed. The figure stared back at them like an accusation. These weren't green recruits prone to exaggeration or miscalculation. These were trained observers from Flak Regiment 155W. Men who understood the mathematics of aerial warfare, who could calculate trajectories and intercept probabilities in their sleep. Yet here they sat, confronted with statistics that violated everything they knew about anti-aircraft warfare. Through their field telescopes mounted on tripods facing the English Channel, these same observers had spent the pre-dawn hours watching something that contradicted every intelligence briefing they'd received about Allied defensive capabilities. The flying bombs, those pilotless aircraft they'd launched toward London in the darkness before sunrise, were being systematically destroyed at rates that seemed to mock the laws of probability itself. What made it particularly disturbing wasn't just the destruction rate, but the manner of destruction. These weren't fighters making dangerous high-speed pursuit curves to catch the missiles. They weren't barrage balloon cables tangling the weapons mid-flight. No, these V-1 rockets were being destroyed by anti-aircraft fire over the coastal gunbelt, shells exploding with a precision that seemed almost supernatural. The explosions weren't direct hits, which would at least make sense within their understanding of ballistic warfare. Instead, shells were detonating near the flying bombs, close enough to tear them apart with shrapnel, yet without requiring the impossible accuracy of direct contact. It was as if the shells themselves possessed some kind of intelligence, some ability to sense when they'd come close enough to their targets to do damage. At the Château d'Auteuil, where Flak Regiment 155W had established its headquarters, Oberst Max Wachtel sat in his office receiving these troubling reports with mounting concern. Wachtel commanded the entire V-1 offensive, and he'd watched the statistics evolve over the summer months with growing alarm that he struggled to conceal from his subordinates. The progression was undeniable and deeply troubling. Back in June, when they'd first begun launching these vengeance weapons against England, the coastal gunbelt had been destroying roughly 17% of the missiles. By late August, that figure had climbed to 74%. And now, during this extraordinary day in the final week of August 1944, it had reached 82%. Wachtel understood, even if his superiors in Berlin did not yet grasp the implications, that they were witnessing the beginning of what would become the most profound technological shock the Wehrmacht's weapon scientists would experience during the entire war. What neither Wachtel nor any German scientist scattered across their shrinking empire could possibly know was that they were observing the operational deployment of one of the Second World War's most jealously guarded technological secrets, a breakthrough so revolutionary in its implications that the Allies had classified it at the same security level as their atomic bomb project. The proximity fuse, which the Allies had deliberately given the misleading designation VT for variable time fuse, was methodically destroying Germany's terror weapon with a precision that German physicists had calculated shouldn't exist within the realm of practical engineering. The chain of events that led to this technological mismatch had begun 10 weeks earlier, on the 13th of June in 1944, exactly 7 days after Allied forces had stormed ashore on the beaches of Normandy. The Führer, responding to the invasion that threatened the Reich's western defences, had finally unleashed his long-promised Vergeltungswaffe, his vengeance weapon, against the British capital. At 25 minutes past 4 in the morning on June 13th, the first V-1 fell on London, impacting in Grove Road in the Bow district. The explosion destroyed a railway bridge and the homes surrounding it. 6 people died in that first attack, 30 more suffered injuries, and 200 found themselves suddenly homeless, their dwellings reduced to rubble in an instant. The weapon itself represented years of German development efforts, countless hours of testing and refinement at facilities like Peenemünde. It was a pilotless aircraft, propelled through the air by an Argus AS 109-014 pulse jet engine, a distinctive design that produced the characteristic buzzing sound that would lead Londoners to call them buzz bombs or doodlebugs. Each missile carried 850 kilograms of Amatol explosive warhead, travelling at 640 kilometers per hour toward its target. This was the world's first operational cruise missile, and the German High Command had convinced themselves that it would break British morale and bring Churchill's government to its knees, forcing them to sue for peace or at least divert crucial resources from the continent back to home defence. Major Walter Dornberger, who headed the V-weapons program at the Peenemünde research facility on the Baltic coast, had performed extensive calculations suggesting that even with what he considered a conservative 25% success rate in reaching their targets, the V-1 campaign would deliver more total explosive power to London than the entire Blitz of 1940 and 1941 combined. The economics seemed compelling from a German perspective. Each V-1 cost approximately 5,000 Reichsmarks to manufacture, a fraction of what a manned bomber mission would cost, and there was no risk to irreplaceable aircrew. The missiles could be launched around the clock in any weather, unlike conventional bombing raids that required trained pilots and favourable conditions. At the Peenemünde Army Research Centre, German scientists and engineers had every reason for confidence in their technical superiority. They had, after all, developed advanced rocket technology that would later form the basis of both American and Soviet space programs. They'd created operational jet aircraft while the Allies were still flying propeller-driven fighters. And now they'd fielded the world's first cruise missile, a weapons system that wouldn't become common until decades after the war ended. Dr. Robert Lusser, the engineer responsible for designing the V-1's automated control system, had performed detailed calculations demonstrating that Allied interception would be nearly impossible using conventional defensive measures. The mathematics seemed sound and unassailable. The flying bomb travelled at 640 kilometers per hour, at varying altitudes between 600 and 2,700 meters above the ground or sea. British fighters, even their fastest models like the Hawker Tempest or modified Spitfires, needed speeds exceeding 650 kilometers per hour just to catch up with the missiles. Once they did manage to intercept, pilots had to close to within 200 meters to have any hope of destroying the V-1 with gunfire, putting themselves at serious risk of being caught in the massive explosion when the warhead detonated. Several Allied pilots were killed or injured attempting such intercepts, their aircraft torn apart by the blast they'd just triggered. As for anti-aircraft fire, the probability calculations seemed even more discouraging for the defenders. The chance of scoring a direct hit on such a small, fast-moving target was calculated by German experts at less than 1 in 10,000 shells fired. This wasn't propaganda meant to boost morale or deceive the public. This was sound ballistic science based on decades of accumulated data about anti-aircraft effectiveness. Conventional time-fused shells required gunners to accurately predict the target's future position, perform precise calculations of distance and altitude, manually set the fuse on each shell to explode at exactly the right moment, and achieve perfect timing in their firing sequence. With the V-1's speed, gunners typically had perhaps 30 seconds from initial detection to engagement, barely enough time to train their weapons and begin firing, let alone perform all the calculations required for accurate time-fused shells. Oberst Max Wachtel, commanding Flak Regiment 155W, understood these limitations intimately from both sides of anti-aircraft warfare. He'd spent years in air defense before taking command of the V-1 offensive, and he knew exactly how difficult it was to hit a high-speed aerial target with ground-based guns. During the course of the campaign, German forces would launch 9,521 V-1 missiles from ground sites directed against England, with many thousands more launched against other targets, including Antwerp and other liberated cities, bringing the total number of V-1s deployed throughout the war to approximately 25,000 units. It was a massive commitment of resources and industrial capacity for a weapon that German planners expected would be virtually unstoppable. Within mere days of the first launches, however, troubling reports began filtering back to German intelligence services. British anti-aircraft defences were adapting with suspicious speed, showing improvements in their intercept rates that seemed to happen too quickly for normal learning and adjustment. By late June, just 2 weeks into the campaign, the interception rate had climbed from 10% to 24%. This was higher than German planners had predicted, certainly, but still explainable within the bounds of normal defensive improvement. Gunners were gaining experience, radar systems were being optimized, defensive positions were being adjusted to optimal locations. All of this was expected and accounted for in the strategic planning. Then came July, and the statistics transformed from concerning to genuinely inexplicable. German technical officers assigned to monitor the campaign's effectiveness began noticing that British guns were claiming V-1 kills while expending impossibly low amounts of ammunition. Observers stationed at coastal positions in France, watching through powerful telescopes as the missiles flew toward England, witnessed V-1s flying steadily on their programmed courses, then suddenly becoming surrounded by flak bursts before tumbling from the sky in flames. The disturbing part was that the explosions appeared to be occurring too far away from the missiles for direct hits, yet the V-1s were being destroyed anyway, as if the shells possessed some ability to damage targets without actually striking them. Unknown to German intelligence services, which were generally quite effective at gathering information about Allied capabilities, they were witnessing the combat deployment of proximity fuses that transformed near misses into lethal hits. The technology itself had actually been operational in the Pacific Theatre since January 1943, when the cruiser USS Helena had shot down a Japanese dive bomber using shells that exploded automatically when they sensed proximity to the target rather than relying on time fuses or direct contact. The German intelligence failure was comprehensive and catastrophic. The Oslo Report, a mysterious document delivered to British intelligence in November 1939 and later shared with Americans, had actually mentioned Allied research into proximity fuses, but German scientists who reviewed the report dismissed this particular claim as disinformation meant to mislead them about real Allied capabilities. Germany had actually attempted to develop similar technology, with over 30 different design approaches researched at various facilities throughout the Reich. But none of these efforts achieved operational status, and German engineers had ultimately concluded that proximity fuses were effectively impossible to produce as practical battlefield weapons. The technical challenges seemed absolutely insurmountable when they examined them in detail. How do you miniaturize radio transmitter-receiver systems small enough to fit inside an artillery shell? How do you make vacuum tubes survive the incredible forces of being fired from a gun, something like 20,000 times the force of gravity? How do you create batteries that can remain dormant for years in storage, yet activate instantly and reliably when needed? How do you achieve mass production of such complex devices at prices that make their widespread use economically feasible? Yet by August 1944, American factories were somehow producing 40,000 VT fuses every single day. During that final week of August 1944, the week when the proximity fuse achieved its maximum demonstrated effectiveness against the V-1 threat, the entire British anti-aircraft defence system had been completely reorganised based on the capabilities this new ammunition provided. Gun batteries were now employing American SCR-584 radar systems for automatic target tracking, feeding firing solutions directly to the weapons. More crucially, they were firing shells equipped with VT fuses that had been specifically modified and optimized for the V-1 threat profile. The Royal Artillery and RAF Regiment units had been redeployed from their previous positions in the North Downs to new positions along the south coast, creating a concentrated gun belt that every V-1 had to pass through on its way to London. This coastal positioning had the additional critical advantage of ensuring that any dud shells that failed to explode would fall harmlessly into the English Channel rather than onto British soil, preventing the Germans from recovering intact examples and reverse engineering the technology. As V-1 missiles crossed the English coastline, they entered a technological kill zone where American engineering and British operational planning combined to trump German statistics and probability calculations. The SCR 584 radar automatically locked onto incoming targets, calculated their trajectories with mechanical computers, and fed precise firing solutions to the gun crews. The proximity fuses themselves contained miniature radio transmitters built with specially designed vacuum tubes developed by companies like Sylvania Electric and Western Electric. When the reflected radio signals indicated the shell had reached proximity to a large metallic object, Theratron switches triggered the detonators, sending thousands of steel fragments slicing through the V-1's thin aluminum hull, rupturing fuel lines, destroying control surfaces, or detonating the warhead. On that peak day in late August, coastal guns destroyed 82% of incoming V-1s, a figure that German engineers and ballistic experts considered physically impossible within their understanding of anti-aircraft warfare. The reports of such astronomical interception rates created crisis meetings at German headquarters. Wachtel personally suspected sabotage might be involved, perhaps resistance members tampering with the missiles before launch. Emergency inspections were ordered of every launch site and maintenance facility. They found nothing wrong with the missiles themselves. Test firings conducted over German-controlled territory showed completely normal performance characteristics. The problem manifested exclusively and mysteriously when the missiles encountered British defences. German technical experts concluded that the British must have developed some kind of revolutionary anti-aircraft system, but they couldn't determine the specific nature of this system without being able to examine captured examples of the equipment involved. They tried varying their tactics in every way they could conceive. They launched missiles at different altitudes, hoping to find a sweet spot that British defences couldn't cover effectively. They fired larger salvos simultaneously, attempting to overwhelm the defensive system through sheer numbers. They switched to night launches, thinking perhaps British accuracy depended on visual tracking. They tried exploiting bad weather that should have degraded radar performance. Nothing worked. Nothing made any meaningful difference. The kill rate remained devastatingly high, week after week. At Peenemünde, scientists and weapons designers faced an uncomfortable conclusion that contradicted their assumptions about German technological superiority. If the Allies had genuinely developed functional proximity fuses, they had achieved something that Germany's best scientists and engineers had concluded was impossible with current technology. It suggested a level of industrial capability and engineering sophistication that called into question fundamental assumptions about the balance of technological advancement between the combatants. German efforts to uncover the secret intensified considerably, but they failed completely and comprehensively. The proximity fuse security arrangements were nearly perfect, a masterpiece of operational security and compartmentalization. Production was distributed across 110 different factories scattered throughout the United States. Workers at each facility knew only their specific assigned tasks, never seeing or understanding how their particular component fit into the larger system. Even the designation variable time was deliberately chosen to be misleading, suggesting a conventional timed fuse that happened to have adjustable settings, rather than revealing anything about proximity sensors or radio systems. By 1944, a substantial portion of America's entire electronics manufacturing industry capacity was devoted to fuse production. 22 million proximity fuses would be manufactured by war's end, a staggering figure that represented an investment of over $1 billion in 1940s currency values, equivalent to perhaps 15 to 20 billion in modern terms. The Crosley Corporation alone, a company that had manufactured radios and refrigerators before the war, produced over 5 million fuses, nearly a quarter of total production volume. The raw numbers revealed a staggering industrial mismatch that German planners had failed to fully appreciate. While Germany struggled to produce V-1 missiles using forced labor from concentration camps and prisoner-of-war facilities, America had transformed its entire consumer electronics industry into a weapons production system for fuse manufacturing. Peak daily production reached 40,000 units, astronomical numbers that German industry simply couldn't match even if they'd possessed the technical knowledge. Unit costs dropped from $732 per fuse in 1942, when initial production runs were small and learning curves steep, to just $18 by 1945, when mass production techniques had been perfected and refined. The Crosley Corporation, which had built its pre-war reputation making affordable radios for American households, employed over 10,000 workers during peak production, churning out 16,000 fuses daily when running at maximum capacity. Sylvania Electric had dedicated its entire vacuum tube research division, dozens of engineers and scientists, to developing ruggedized components capable of surviving the brutal forces of artillery firing. At peak production, Sylvania was manufacturing 400,000 miniaturized vacuum tubes daily, an almost incomprehensible figure representing 95% of all the specialized tubes used in proximity fuse production. The contrast was absolute and damning. Germany was handcrafting weapons in limited numbers using slave labor working under brutal conditions. America was mass-producing revolutionary technology at unprecedented scale using voluntary workers earning premium wages with overtime pay. Monthly American proximity fuse production alone exceeded the total number of V-1 missiles Germany managed to produce during the entire war. The industrial capacity gap was simply insurmountable once it reached this scale. The proximity fuse itself represented extraordinary engineering achievement that required solving multiple, seemingly impossible problems simultaneously. The device had to survive being fired from an artillery gun, enduring 20,000 times the force of gravity during acceleration, spinning at 25,000 revolutions per minute, experiencing extreme temperature variations, yet still function reliably when it reached the target area. Sylvania's engineers developed miniature vacuum tubes based on hearing aid technology, since hearing aids were among the few pre-war applications requiring very small, robust tubes, but these had to be massively reinforced to survive the forces involved in artillery firing. The batteries presented their own unique challenge. They had to remain completely dormant during years of storage, showing no degradation or power loss, yet activate instantly and reliably when the shell was fired, providing consistent power throughout the few seconds of flight time. The fuse contained a miniature radio transmitter that broadcast signals continuously during flight, a remarkable feat of engineering when you consider the size constraints and power limitations. When reflections from these transmitted signals indicated proximity to large metallic objects, electronic circuits triggered the detonation mechanism. This seemingly simple concept in principle required solving dozens of intricate engineering problems to achieve in practice. Of the 9,521 V-1s launched from ground sites specifically against Britain, only 2,515 actually reached London and its surrounding areas, managing to penetrate all the defensive layers the British had erected. These missiles killed 6,184 civilians and injured 17,981 more. While these casualties were undeniably tragic, representing real human suffering and loss, they constituted a small fraction of what German planners had intended and expected to inflict. General Frederick Pyle, commanding Britain's anti-aircraft command, performed detailed calculations after the war, demonstrating that without proximity fuses, the V-1 campaign would have been perhaps 5 to 10 times more destructive, potentially killing and injuring over 100,000 people, with incalculable effects on British morale and war production. As the summer of 1944 progressed and the effectiveness of British defences became undeniable, German commanders made increasingly desperate attempts to salvage the V-1 campaign. They began air-launching V-1s from modified Heinkel bombers flying over the North Sea, trying to bypass the coastal gun belt entirely. These air-launched versions travelled too fast for most conventional interceptions and achieved somewhat better penetration rates. But these desperate measures couldn't achieve meaningful strategic impact. The weapon that was supposed to bring Britain to its knees had become merely an expensive nuisance, a costly failure consuming resources that were desperately needed on other fronts where German armies were being pushed back on all sides. The German failure to detect the existence of proximity fuses represented one of the greatest intelligence disasters in military history. Despite maintaining extensive spy networks and possessing considerable technical expertise in signals intelligence and weapons analysis, German intelligence services never grasped what they were actually facing. The Allied proximity fuse program remained completely secret throughout the entire duration of the war. Not a single intact proximity fuse fell into German hands during the V-1 campaign, despite thousands being fired. The security precautions, the coastal positioning of guns, and the compartmentalized production all worked exactly as intended. Most remarkably, during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, German forces managed to capture an American ammunition supply dump that actually contained stockpiles of proximity-fused artillery shells. They had the technology literally in their hands, but they never recognized what they were holding. Their fundamental assumption that such devices were impossible to manufacture blinded them completely to the evidence sitting right in front of them. They saw the shells, noted the unusual markings and designations, but never imagined they were examining the technology that had defeated their vengeance weapon campaign. After Germany's final surrender in May 1945, Allied interrogators questioned German military and scientific personnel extensively about their understanding of why the V-1 had failed so catastrophically. Oberst Max Wachtel told Allied officers that he and his staff had suspected the British must have developed either dramatically improved radar systems or perhaps some method of setting time fuses much faster than conventional approaches allowed, but they had never even conceived of the possibility of self-thinking shells that could sense their proximity to targets. German scientists and engineers, when shown captured examples of American VT fuses and given detailed explanations of how they functioned, expressed complete disbelief initially. They couldn't comprehend how vacuum tubes could survive the acceleration forces of artillery firing, how batteries could remain viable during storage yet activate reliably, how electronic circuits could continue functioning after experiencing such brutal treatment. They estimated, quite accurately it turned out, that they were approximately 10 years behind American electronics technology, a gap that seemed impossible given Germany's pre-war leadership in many fields of physics and engineering. Dr. Merle Tuve, who led the proximity fuse development effort at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, reflected after the war that their success came primarily from systematic collaboration between academic scientists, practical engineers, and skilled production workers, creating a unified development and manufacturing system that totalitarian approaches simply couldn't replicate effectively. The proximity fuse demonstrated conclusively that the Second World War's ultimate outcome was being determined in research laboratories and manufacturing facilities just as much as on battlefields. While Germany pursued increasingly exotic wonder weapons, each more technically impressive than the last but produced in tiny numbers, America focused relentlessly on what they called multiplicative technologies, improvements that enhanced the effectiveness of existing conventional weapons systems, rather than replacing them entirely. The proximity fuse made every single anti-aircraft gun 5 to 10 times more effective than before, a force multiplier of extraordinary magnitude. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal stated publicly after the war that the proximity fuse had helped blaze the trail to Japan, noting that without the protection this ingenious device provided to surface ships of the fleet, the westward advance across the Pacific would have been much slower and the cost in ships and sailors would have been immeasurably greater. The fuse proved decisive in defending against kamikaze attacks, where conventional time-fused shells were nearly useless against such small, fast, maneuverable targets. The V-1 production program relied heavily on slave labor, a fact that adds moral dimensions to its strategic failure. Tens of thousands of concentration camp prisoners died in the underground factories where V-1 components were manufactured, working under horrific conditions without adequate food, clothing, or medical care. Meanwhile, American workers producing proximity fuses were volunteers working for premium wages with overtime pay, not knowing exactly what they were producing, but understanding its importance to the war effort. At Sylvania's facility in Ipswich, Massachusetts, over 5,000 women worked 12-hour shifts producing specialized electronic components. They discovered only after victory in Europe that their work had helped save London from Germany's terror weapons, protecting hundreds of thousands of civilians they would never meet. The proximity fuse secret held completely and perfectly throughout the conflict. British anti-aircraft crews firing the special ammunition didn't even know what made their shells so remarkably effective. They understood only that they had received special ammunition with extremely strict accounting requirements. Every single proximity-fused shell fired at V-1s had to be meticulously tracked and documented. Unexploded shells had to be immediately secured and transported to secure facilities. Naval vessels continuously patrolled the English Channel specifically to prevent German forces from recovering dud shells that might have fallen into the water. This obsessive secrecy actually cost Allied lives in a tragic irony. Ground forces fighting in France and later Germany couldn't be issued proximity-fused artillery shells until December 1944, months after they could have benefited enormously from the technology. Thousands of soldiers died in battles where proximity fuses could have made crucial differences, but the technology was considered too secret to risk, too valuable to potentially lose to German intelligence if shells were captured or failed to detonate. Yet the decision to use them against V-1s over the English Channel, where recovery by Germany was nearly impossible, was justified by London's crucial importance during the invasion period. British morale had to be maintained. War production had to continue uninterrupted. The civilian population couldn't be allowed to suffer catastrophic casualties that might have affected their support for the war effort. For Germany, the V-1 program ultimately drained critical resources while achieving minimal strategic impact. Launching approximately 25,000 V-1s in total cost millions of Reichsmarks, diverted thousands of skilled workers and engineers, and consumed resources that could have produced hundreds of fighter aircraft or thousands of anti-tank weapons desperately needed on the shrinking eastern and western fronts. The program's dependence on slave labor added a moral dimension to its failure that would only be fully understood and documented after the war ended. The proximity fuse had defeated weapons that were literally built through systematic human suffering, a contrast between democratic production and totalitarian methods that carried symbolic weight beyond the immediate tactical results. The proximity fuse represented warfare's fundamental transformation from individual combat to industrial systems competition. It proved beyond any doubt that modern warfare had become primarily a contest of industrial production capacity and engineering sophistication, rather than traditional military virtues like courage or tactical brilliance. Before saving Pacific Fleet vessels from Japanese air attacks and helping enable the final advance toward Tokyo, the proximity fuse saved London from Germany's vengeance weapon campaign. The Germans, watching their V-1s tumbling from the sky in flames, never understood what was destroying them. The technology defeating their carefully crafted weapons was literally inconceivable within their scientific and industrial framework, operating on principles they'd concluded were impossible to implement practically. The transformation in anti-aircraft effectiveness was genuinely dramatic and historically unprecedented. Before proximity fuses were deployed, destroying a single V-1 required an average of 2,500 heavy anti-aircraft shells, an expenditure of ammunition that was barely economically sustainable, even for an industrial power like Britain. With proximity fuses, this figure dropped catastrophically to just 100 shells per kill, a 25-fold improvement in ammunition efficiency. The coastal gun belt's interception rate rose from 17% in June to 82% in late August, an improvement achieved in just 10 weeks that would have taken years or decades using conventional technology improvement approaches. This wasn't achieved through superior courage, better training, or tactical innovation, though British gunners certainly demonstrated all of these qualities. It was achieved through the mass production of advanced technology on a scale Germany couldn't match or even fully comprehend. America had mobilized its entire electronics manufacturing industry, employed over 80,000 workers in fuse-related production, and invested over $1 billion to produce 22 million fuses. The sheer scale of this industrial effort was something German planners had fundamentally failed to anticipate or account for in their strategic calculations. The proximity fuse was officially declassified in September 1945, just weeks after Japan's surrender. The War Department's public announcement began with the dramatic statement that this was one of the most important weapons developed during the war, surpassed in effectiveness only by the atomic bomb itself. For German scientists and engineers who had spent months puzzling over inexplicable V-1 failure rates, the revelation brought both understanding and profound humiliation. They had been defeated not primarily by superior strategy or exceptional courage, though the Allies demonstrated both, but by industrial capacity operating at scales they hadn't imagined were possible for weapons production. Post-war interviews with captured German weapons scientists revealed their shock and disbelief at the magnitude of American production. They had believed their V-1 represented the absolute pinnacle of achievable weapons technology within wartime constraints. Learning that it had been systematically defeated by mass-produced electronics costing less than $20 each by war's end was devastating to their professional pride and their understanding of technological competition. They had lost not to superior warriors or better generals, but to assembly lines staffed by workers who didn't even know what they were making, producing revolutionary technology in quantities that seemed to mock everything they thought they understood about weapons manufacturing. The proximity fuse technology evolved after the war into modern air defense systems, radar altimeters used in every commercial aircraft, and sophisticated electronic warfare capabilities that define contemporary military operations. For Germany's former weapons scientists, many of whom went on to work for American or Soviet programs after the war, it remained a permanent reminder of their wartime blindness to American industrial capabilities. The proximity fuse proved conclusively that in modern industrial warfare, the ability to mass-produce merely good technology matters infinitely more than the ability to craft individually perfect weapons in small numbers. Germany produced brilliant individual weapons throughout the war, engineering masterpieces like the Me-262 jet fighter, the Type 21 submarine, and advanced tank designs. America produced effective weapons by the millions, prioritizing quantity and reliability over technical perfection. The Sherman tank wasn't as well armored or as powerfully armed as German heavy tanks, but American factories produced over 40,000 of them, while Germany struggled to produce a few thousand Tigers and Panthers. The same industrial logic applied to proximity fuses, radar systems, and countless other technologies that ultimately decided the war's outcome. On that remarkable day in late August 1944, when proximity fuses destroyed 82% of incoming German V-1 missiles, the fundamental nature of warfare changed forever in ways that wouldn't be fully understood for years. The Germans launching their vengeance weapons from sites along the French coast never knew what invisible technology was systematically defeating them. They had done everything right according to their understanding of weapons development and deployment. They'd created advanced weapons through impressive engineering, trained elite technical crews, achieved genuine technological breakthroughs in propulsion and guidance systems. Yet they were being comprehensively defeated by mass-produced electronics they couldn't even imagine existed, let alone understand how to counter or replicate. The proximity fuse saved London through thousands upon thousands of small explosions high above the English Channel and the Kent coastline, each detonation guided by technology that German scientists had deemed impossible to achieve as a practical battlefield weapon. It represented industrial democracy's triumph over totalitarian engineering approaches, the victory of mass production over crafted perfection, the success of multiplied simple solutions over complex wonder weapons produced in inadequate numbers. The Germans never discovered what was hitting their V-1s as they fell burning from the sky over southern England, defeated by a technological secret they couldn't conceive of and an industrial capacity they couldn't hope to match, even if they'd understood what they were facing. The proximity fuse had turned the Führer's much-vaunted vengeance weapon into London's salvation, protecting hundreds of thousands of civilians from the terror-bombing campaign that was supposed to break British morale. And the Germans never understood how or why their carefully calculated weapon had failed so catastrophically until long after it mattered strategically, after their armies had been pushed back to the Rhine and beyond, after Berlin itself had fallen to Soviet forces advancing from the east. In the end, perhaps America's greatest victory in the Second World War wasn't achieved on famous battlefields like Normandy or Iwo Jima, but in the factories where millions of workers, a huge proportion of them women who didn't even know what they were contributing to, produced the tiny electronic devices that saved a city and fundamentally transformed how future wars would be fought. That 82% interception rate achieved in late August 1944 stood as mathematical proof that in modern industrial warfare, production capacity and engineering sophistication could defeat any wonder weapon, no matter how ingeniously designed or carefully crafted. The proximity fuse was far more than just another weapon in the Allied arsenal. It was living evidence that democracy's ability to mobilize scientific research and industrial production could systematically overcome tyranny's forced brilliance and slave labor manufacturing. And the Germans, watching their perfect weapons falling from the sky in flames day after day, never understood why their calculations had been so catastrophically wrong. They had already lost a war that their leaders kept insisting they were winning, defeated not on battlefields but in American factories they'd never see, by workers whose names they'd never know, producing technology they'd concluded was impossible to create.